Morning in progress.
And I can take this off.
While you're talking, there's church just out.
Sure, I understand.
Just keep it on. Yeah, please take it off.
I affirm
Your
that.
broadcast better.
You know, Union Seminary, they're requiring you and
No, I got this.
professors to wear a mask.
It's hard to.
Right.
Hard to hear.
Yeah. Very deep. Because she's fast and sick. Sure.
Yeah. Good. It's a good time. So, well, we got another one coming up in mid-December.
Anna, could you quickly run through those, the PowerPoint?
Sure.
Is that possible?
Yes, I will practice sharing the screen actually. So,
Okay. Okay. Ooh. So when it does that, see, it was
Yeah.
doing that, it doesn't do that when I put it in the presentation.
yeah, all right, let me figure out. How do I do that again? I know there's a way.
Takes all that stuff out of it.
I guess
Slideshow.
slideshow, okay.
Ooh, is that gonna be a problem?
I don't think so.
Because that's cutting the folk on Zoom out, right?
Is it, oh, on Zoom?
That's in presentation.
Yeah. I can't tell if the people on Zoom can see it or not. Let me see.
Know that it doesn't stop.
No, I'm not gonna go to that. I decided not to go to that for. So that's
Okay.
fine. Yeah, we're not gonna
So
go.
in show,
I think that's gonna be a bridge too far.
Or hit escape.
okay.
Hit escape.
Oh, stop share. Okay. And now I can make this big. Okay.
So does that work?
That works. Yeah. And then I'll just, if someone say share the screen, I'll probably just leave it there for a little while if you want.
Yeah.
Unless you want to, you can tell me to stop sharing.
So you tried to use your good eye?
Opened it up to people.
I have not. Should I go ahead and
Yeah.
let people in?
Yes, nine. Rick, you need a little bit more time.
No, y'all go ahead. I'm just gonna unplug this one and y'all will be okay with that.
Okay.
We need to move Roger closer. So
I don't really think so.
or can we move that one?
This can't move down anymore. I think you'll be okay, actually. I really do.
I'm going to
Do
admit
you want,
all.
do you want the microphone I said last week?
Unless
I'm gonna move around.
he's gonna move around, so.
Will it pick me up?
Yeah. The closer you are to it, the better. Not right on top, but I'm just wondering if we should just move everything. We'll do, I'll do a mic check.
Okay.
Talking, make sure everybody can hear us.
This is, and it has a bio, which we'll read later, just so I didn't get up in time. See, they're not me.
How we doing? You ready?
Oh, yes, we're ready.
Okay, so the hour has arrived, 9 o'clock on Sunday. A little chill in the air this morning. Welcome, Slave Oz. Good to see you. Welcome, everyone. Roger Gench is with us for the next 2 Sundays to lead us in a discussion on dangerous memory and anti-racist political theology of the cross. For those of you who don't know Roger, he retired after 17 years in 2019 as senior pastor of New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., and currently serves as theologian
in
resident at Second Presbyterian Church here.
Best job I've ever had.
In Richmond, yeah.
Because nobody knows what it means.
And
It's only 5 hours a week.
yeah, so I'm gonna take my mask off. Yeah, but he is mainly known to be the husband of Francis Taylor Gench, who is currently serving as a professor of biblical interpretation. Did I get all that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's good. Welcome. Glad you're here, Roger and Francis. Welcome to you too as well. Happy Veterans Day. Little belated, but happy Veterans Day to all you veterans out there, and thank you so much for your service. November 14th is today, and guess what's happening after the church service? Reception for Wilson Kennedy, yes.
And we have enough cupcakes for you to take them home to your whole family.
There you go. Okay, just wanted to do, for those of you on Zoom, can y'all hear us okay in the room? Quick thumbs up, maybe? Yeah. Good, okay. Please, for those of you who are on Zoom, please remember to mute your microphone when you're not if you're not speaking, and please type any questions you have into the chat function. Please keep in your thoughts and prayers those on the special concerns list. Excuse me. In particular, the Duncan family. I understand the Owen family. Duncan. Sorry, the Owen family. Thank you, honey. I knew that's why you showed up this morning. Keep me in line. The Owen family. Irene is still in ICU. Still has a breathing tube, unfortunately. So we're still hoping and praying that she will get better and out of ICU and off the breathing tube.
The last communication is doing better.
Yes.
That was last night,
The-
late last night.
Yeah, I think the Saturday report was better than the Friday. There is what is the website is Caring Bridge, if you can see the updates on the Caring Bridge. Anyway, also keep those families and those serving in the military in your thoughts and prayers as well. Are there any other joys, concerns, or announcements to share with the class before I turn it over to Roger? Okay, Roger, welcome. So glad to have you.
Great to be here again. And last time we were together, we were all on Zoom, and it was exciting but limited. I got used to Zoom, but I still would rather be in person than in the boxes. But I understand it, and I tell you that I might not have retired if I had known that all of our session meetings could now be on Zoom. That would have extended my ministry significantly. The title for this presentation is A Dangerous Memory, an anti-racist political theology of the cross. And I realize that sounds incredibly academic. And I'm just going to unpack a little bit about what that means. I have spent probably the last 40 years, I guess, possessed by trying to understand the cross in the Christian tradition, and in particular, the theology of the cross. When I was I wasn't always Presbyterian. I grew up Baptist, evangelical, became Presbyterian in a very dubious place, Waco, Texas, and the Baptist cathedral in Baylor University, where I was attending, and I was doing graduate work there, and became Presbyterian there. Then came out to Union Seminary, where I met my wife on the 5th floor of the library, the old library. Do you remember the old library? It was before the new library, where the longtime mentor of this class, John Trotty, is now enshrined in a gargoyle. I wish you really should have one of those things right here for this class. I think I love John Trotty. He was a dear person to me and helped me through a dissertation there, and did my PhD, Master of Theology and PhD. In fact, Francis and I did them together. I started mine 2 years before her, and she finished one person before me on the graduation, I think because of alphabetical order. But we spent a long time at Union Seminary. And one of the pivotal moments of my understanding of the cross came while I was, if you remember Donald Daw, who used to teach theology, probably taught in his class a few times, right? He had us read in my very first year in graduate work at Union Seminary, Jürgen Moltmann's The Crucified God, which was a radical book in 1978. I tell you, it kind of broke down the firewalls between a God who does not suffer and a God who does suffer. And at least for Protestants, it did. There were people that were talking about that long before Jürgen Moltmann, including in some ways Martin Luther, although he didn't totally break down that firewall. And the firewall I'm talking about is between, in the Trinity, between God the Father and God the Son, using this patriarchal language, excuse me. But the firewall is that God the Father does not suffer with the Son, that only the Son suffers. And so to say that God the Father suffered is a form of heresy. And that came out of Greek thought, that thought that any suffering was on earth, and anything that was as perfect as God would be without suffering. And so that lasted for some, depending on whether it's in the New Testament, which I would suggest it is not, that is a God who does not suffer. But that lasted for 2,000 years up until, and really it was the Holocaust, it was World War II, the Holocaust, the Civil Rights Movement, the ecological movement that began to break down the firewall between God the Father and God the Son. And the whole notion that God the Son is the only one who suffered on the cross. So when Jürgen Moltmann wrote The Crucified God, that was a radical notion, especially for Protestants, and he is considered within the Reformed umbrella of, in which Presbyterians stand. So that's a significant kind of a thing that that Jürgen Moltmann did. And I struggle with a lot of what he says in that book, but that breaking down of that firewall made a huge difference to me. The interesting thing was that it made me understand and see the God of the Exodus. And you will remember that in Exodus 3, when God is finally introduced to the story of Pharaoh and the ancient Hebrews, it says that God saw the suffering of the people, God heard their cry, and God knew their suffering. And that word know, yada, it has to do with not just mental knowing, but a heart knowing. That's a feeling. So the notion that God suffers comes from the first stages of the biblical story. Now, Greek thought, again, took over in the Christian tradition. And so we had this notion of a God who was impassible, that did not suffer. And there's a hierarchy to that too, by the way, because the hierarchy is that if God the Father doesn't suffer in heaven, then those on the top of the hierarchy on earth don't suffer either, right? So there's a hierarchical order of society. This is a social and political comment, okay? And this keeps the order in place, in other words. So those on the top of the social political order, the elite, the privileged, the wealthy, have a firewall between them and those who suffer below them. And so this becomes all part of a divine plan in which, by the way, the enslavement of people takes its place. And it's important to kind of see that whole mechanism of the hierarchy that the Greek thought put in place, which lasted through Anselm, and who was the classic theology of the cross in the 11th century. And Anselm is enshrined in our Presbyterian tradition because he's in a family of satisfaction atonement theory, substitutionary atonement theory, which John Calvin subscribed to and articulated, and that got enshrined in our Presbyterian Book of Confessions. So this is very much a part of our Book of Confessions. Now let me just unpack that, just to remind you of it, even though it's in our hymns, It's all over almost everything that we do. It is the notion that God cannot forgive without an innocent sacrifice that substitutes for humankind, and therefore provides the mechanism for God forgiving our sin. That is satisfaction atonement. I mean, that's a gross simplification of both satisfaction atonement and substitutionary atonement, which are of a family that has been passed down to us. That's a huge thing. And it's important to also say that Anselm was 11th century theologian, same time as the Crusades, same time as, and his model was the hierarchy of a feudal society. And God for him was a feudal lord, again, impassible. It was a hierarchy of society. What St. Anselm said was that the order that God has put in place, which is a hierarchical order of the feudal order of the feudal lord going down to peasants, is the natural order of creation. And whenever that is violated, then God's order is violated. And so for St. Anselm, the substitution of Christ that forgave sins reestablishes that hierarchical order. And that's the worldview in which Anselm lived. And by the way, he was a very, very powerful figure. St. Anselm of Canterbury was the Pope of that part of the world and was almost acknowledged as such. Even the Pope in Italy acknowledged that St. Anselm in Britain was the Pope of that world, and was, as far as land holdings and as far as wealth, was almost equal to the King of England. Almost equal. That's Anselm of Canterbury, the one who came up with that notion of the cross, in which God can only forgive with an innocent sacrifice that Jesus provided, which reestablished the order of the hierarchy. I'm saying all that. I know I'm going through a lot of stuff here. I'm saying all this to put into bold display what happened in the last part of the 20th century, when the firewall between God the Father, God the Son broke down, and the notion that God suffered with God the Father suffered with the Son. So this is a suffering God, as Moltmann put it, the crucified God, the crucified God. So you see what a radical notion that is. Now, along with that, what was happening at the same time were liberation movements going all through Central and South America. One of the privileges I had in my church in Baltimore was being in a sister parish relationship with a church in El Salvador that was created on a trash dump outside of San Salvador. Why that church was created there was because of displacement, because of the Salvadoran Civil War. They were displaced from their countryside into El Salvador on this trash dump, and the church was Madre de los Pobres, which is Mother of the Poor. This was a church that was one of the seed beds for liberation theology in Central America. And it was during some of my time down there that I learned about the death squads that during the time of that civil war in El Salvador murdered some 70,000 people that they considered insurrectionists, or they considered on the other side of the divide in that civil war. And so the interesting thing was how theologians, especially the theologians at the University of Central America in San Salvador, articulated what the death squads were doing as akin to the crucifixion. And it was. The death squads were not just killing people, but it was killing with style. And by the way, they learned that from the U.S. military and some of the practices of the death squads. It's a well-known. That's a well-known connection, and it was killing with style to reinsert the domination of the elite in El Salvador, which in essence was how the crucifixion functioned in the ancient world. The crucifixion at its base was a witness to the domination system of the Roman Empire. It was killing with style. Now, the Roman Empire didn't have enough troops to control all of their colonies. And so to keep the colonies subjugated, anybody who was suspected of anything like insurrection was crucified. And so when they crucified somebody, it was a horrible form of torture, like the death squads. And by the way, like lynching, the same thing, I forgot to mention that, James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And if you'll remember the last time I was with you, we did James Cone's book. The connection that everyone, that folk in El Salvador and Central America made with crucifixion and the death squads, crucifixion and violence of all sorts, was what James Cone, the connection James Cone made with the cross and the lynching tree. The same thing. It was keeping domination in place. That's what it was about. And so in Roman crucifixion, it didn't happen in private. It happened along, I-95. It happened along the highways and byways because they wanted the Romans wanted the people to see what would happen to them if they ever bucked the Roman Empire. That was crucifixion. That somehow got domesticated during the Constantinian takeover, what is called the Constantinian takeover of the church, the Roman Emperor Constantine in the 3rd century. And slowly but surely the cross became domesticated. And it still was in some ways about keeping the hierarchy in place. But what ended up happening with the cross was that it functioned in a very kind of domesticated, privatized way as forgiveness of sin or a display of divine love, rather than an exposure to violence in the world and the abuse of power, large and small, which is what it was in the New Testament, which is what it was in the Roman Empire. So, so slowly but surely, my understanding of the cross from the time that I read Jürgen Moltmann's Crucified God, and then read Dorothy Soli's Suffering, and Johann Baptist Metz, who we're going to talk about in just a second, a Catholic theologian. All of them young Germans, all of them were teenagers during the tail end of World War II, and all of them had a horrific experience of Nazi Germany, and all of them responded with a theology of the cross accordingly. And important to say that all of them began to articulate and were in conversation with one another. And this is where I was trying to get to with this long extended introduction. I'm sorry it's so long, but I feel like I've got to unpack even just the title of this of these 2 sessions that I'm going to do with you. They articulated what is now called political theology, and they actually called it that, as opposed to domesticated theology, privatized theology, that is, theology that is only between me and God. They articulated political theology to engage the Christian faith in the politics of the world. And they did not mean by that political parties. They took the Greek word for polis, which means our common life together, the common good. It has to be, the Christian faith has to be about our common life together and the common good. And because Jürgen Moltmann and Johann Baptist Metz and Dorothy Soli saw the suffering, especially of the Jews in particular, during their time, but also of the poor, because Johann Baptist Metz traveled to places like El Salvador. He got to know John Sobrino, one of the Jesuits that was one of the more interesting articulators of the theology of the cross. He was the one that coined the term crucified people. And that's what he saw the people in El Salvador. Johann Baptist Metz met him And so he articulated a theology of the cross accordingly. We're going to talk about Johann Baptist Metz in just a second. So when I talk about political theology, I'm not talking about Democrats and Republicans, although I hope Democrats and Republicans can learn something from our understanding of political theology. I hope they can. I'm talking about theology that embraces the common good and gets in public life. And so it's and to me, in fact, Jürgen Moltmann went as far as to say that the only theology that is relevant is political theology. And he was so, a little bit of his history is probably interesting to get at. He, like Johann Baptist Metz, were 16, 17 years old towards the tail end of World War II when they were conscripted into the German army. They were, you remember the stories of how the Germans just went after the youngest to get folk to shore up their ranks on the front lines. Jürgen Moltmann was captured as a prisoner of war, spent some time in both in London and in the United States, and he read a Bible for the first time while he was in a prisoner of war camp, and he came to understand the God of the cross reading the Bible. Can you imagine reading the Bible for the first time under those circumstances? It would give a different read, right? It would give a different read. And so you can understand how his understanding of who God is became, shall we say, I don't want to say radicalized, because I think it should be kind of the new normal, that we understand what our vocation is as Christians, to do political theology and to do theology for the common good. So let me just fast forward. I've been doing political theology of the cross now for probably 12, 13, 14 years. And that probably was doing it before then, but I would never have articulated it as such. By the way, I have two books in which I talk about it. If you want to read this book, my last one is The Cross Examined. I'd love it to come back and do that book with you sometime if you want. If you maybe even read it, we can talk about it. But it was after the racial reckoning of 2 summers ago that I began to realize that we need to be articulating, churches need to be articulating an anti-racist theology of the cross. We need to be focusing on that kind of thing. So let's go to the first slide. I want to talk to you a little bit about somebody that really influenced me. I was actually reading this book the summer before, Eddie Glaude, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own Time. If you haven't read that book, that is an absolutely magnificent book on James Baldwin. Ernie Glaude teaches religion and African-American studies at Princeton University. And in this book, Professor Glaude talks about James Baldwin's understanding of racism in America as the lie. He simply refers to it as the lie. And according to Glaude, James Baldwin just says that disrupting the lie requires a frank and dangerous confrontation with the past, with memory, individual and collective. As Glaude puts it, and this is one of the most haunting quotes. In some ways, I'd like to just stop there. You go to the next slide, if you would, thank you. One of the most haunting quotes of the last couple of years of my life, and I think it is so relevant to what we're going on in America today. In some ways, I'd like just to kind of get a conversation about this quote. We could take our whole Sunday school session with this quote. Baldwin's moral vision requires a confrontation with history, with slavery, and with ongoing consequences of the after times, shorn of the rosy tint of American innocence in order to overcome its hold on us. Ours, he says, and this is Glaude speaking, ours, he says, is a cold civil war. We have those who are desperately holding on to a vision of America that never made sense, at least to me, and those who are fighting for the birth of a new America, that even as we fight, the divisions in the country feel old and worn. Today feels like we are fighting old ghosts that have the country by the throat. That's a haunting quote, isn't it? Whether you agree with it or not, that's a haunting quote. Excuse me, I can't get this out of my head, so I'm gonna give it to you. In the Washington Post, they did this political cartoon. This was just like this was before our last election here in Virginia, so it was that's 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. And they had Union reenactors in their garb and Confederate reenactors in their guard. And by the way, Frances, my wife, taught at the Lutheran Seminary in Gettysburg for the first 13 years of her career. So we actually got to see a lot of those reenactors as they came in during the Battle of Gettysburg. So we know that this kind of stuff actually does happen. But the reenactors, one was on one side and the other was on the other side, and the director of it all said, now today we're going to reenact a school board meeting. That's supposed to be fun. That is true, isn't it? So, okay. So move to the next slide, if you would. And this is, by the way, I'm just going to my essay right now. This is an essay, by the way, that I wrote for interpretation, the journal at the Journal Bible and Theology at Union Presbyterian Seminary. For me, the cross of Christ is an essential Christian resource for this moment. Let me speak to that just for a second. In the very first paragraph, which I did not include in this, I talked about this as a Kairos moment for us. And this was, again, right after the racial reckoning of, after the George Floyd, what I call lynching. And this was right after that summer of unrest that was really an insurrection. This is, and I talked about it as a Kairos moment, using that word, Greek word Kairos, which means God's time that comes into the fallenness of what the Greek word for chronos, which is chronological time. And it's a critical thing. And the New Testament talks about Christ, the time of Christ is the Kairos time. And so, that's kind of what I have in mind when I talk about this moment. It's a Kairos time, or what I call a Kairotic time. It exposes the ghost of our past, awakening dangerous memory that lays them bare. Indeed, I would contend that it is a critical resource for the church's reflection and action in a twofold sense. First, dangerous memory of Jesus crucified and risen awakens and confronts the lie of racism, past and present. Theologian James Cone has raised to visibility the haunting parallels between the cross and the lynching tree, between the nature of Jesus' execution and the lynching of Black bodies in the American context. Second, once dangerous memory is awakened and exposed by the cross, it empowers us for new lives of restorative justice. In this essay, I offer for your consideration of theological biblical resources for reflection on the cross that can inform the church's navigation of this Kairos moment as it discerns what God is calling us to be and do. Let me just talk a little bit about now my own theology of the cross. What the cross is at its base is an exposure to the violence of the world, the abuses of power, large and small. What my teacher, Doug Otati, some of you remember him, taught at Union Seminary many years, the crosses that litter the landscape of the world. Is large, the cross is large and small. It exposes them. It disrupts the powers that create abusiveness, and it reveals the empowering love of God for resistance, and I would add, agitation. Agitation, that becomes a very big thing in this essay, because I spent before I came here, I've spent 30 years in community organizing in both my church in Baltimore and my church in Washington, D.C. And the agitational part of that, which is not about irritating people, it's about agitating people. It's about moving people to act. It's moving people to act on the grief and angers that they've got inside of them. There's something in the community organizing that is one of the most powerful tools that I have been promoting in churches throughout my ministry. It's called the relational meeting. The relational meeting is a one-on-one meeting where you don't have light talk. It's not just a conversation about family and friends over coffee, although it might be about family and friends and neighborhoods and this, that, and the other. But it tries to get at what we call anger, and the origin of the word anger has to do with a grief, a deep grief about a loss, something that one is grieving that we've lost in society. The relational meeting is not a private meeting; it's a public meeting. That doesn't mean that you do it in an outside, outside the coffee shop. It means it's about public life. It's about, or as I call it, political life. It's about what you're grieving in society, what you would like, in other words, to act on, what you would like to act on. Now, I call the relational meeting cruciform. That is, it's cruciform, and that's cross form, that's cross shaped, because it gets at those wounded spots where God is seeking to move us. Yeah, that's it. So I have talked a whole lot, and I have given you a whole lot of information. And I'm sure, what's going on? I'm almost out of time. I don't know how much more to go. I do want to get to Johann Baptist Metz here in a second. Let me just do Johann Baptist Metz. I will get to, and then I'll ask for your questions. So Hannah, if you would keep going forward. Oh, I'm going to come back next week to Sean Copeland, because that is just absolutely. This is it. Okay. Yeah, right before that. Metz's political theology. So again, Johann Baptist Metz, along with Dorothy Solie. Dorothy Solie was not conscripted into the German army, but she had horrific experiences because of Jewish friends that she had, friends being taken, and friends being ostracized, and friends being excluded. She knew of families that tried to hide Jewish children. Some of her friends. This was just, so she came out of this experience in one way. Jürgen Moltmann came out of his experience in another way. Johann Baptist Metz was also conscripted into the German army, and he was sent to the front lines. And his commander wanted him to go to the commandant headquarters to deliver a message, and he did. And when he got back, all he saw were the dead bodies of his 16 teenage comrades. Evidently, an Allied tank regiment had come over them and simply wiped them out. And he said that and as you can imagine, he was 16 years old. He said it was the most horrific experience of his life. It changed his life forever. He went into ministry, went into theology. He's Catholic, by the way, and studied with the great theologian Karl Rahner, who himself experienced his own struggles with the Nazis, as did Karl Barth in our own Presbyterian tradition. That's another story, by the way. But it's really interesting. To me, one of the reasons I'm going back, by the way, to some of these folk is because given the current political climate that we're living in, I think it's very interesting to go back and look at how theologians were responding to the tyranny of the Nazis and how they were articulating that. Johann Baptist Metz is one of the best. I don't have his book, and I'm forgetting the name of his book. Passion for God is something like that. I'll get it for you next week. And I realized I left the footnote out that would give the name of his book. That's a fabulous book, by the way. But let me just read this, and then I'll ask for questions. Metz's political theology bears witness to the dangerous Christ. This book, by the way, is 2001. His political theology bears witness to the dangerous Christ who breaks through the forgetfulness of the sufferings of others. He states the import of this every bit as much as pointedly as I went over a quote from Ella Curea, who was, by the way, one of the Jesuits in El Salvador that was slaughtered by the death squads. That was, if you remember the 6 Jesuits that were slaughtered by the death squads during the Civil War, he was one of them. And he has a horrific, he has some really interesting things to say about theology of the cross, which I might get to next week. So this is what Johann Baptist Metz says. Whoever hears the message of the resurrection of Christ in such a way that the cry of the crucified becomes inaudible in it, hears not gospel but myth. To follow Jesus, he says, is to risk danger and persecution. Yet for Metz, this is where salvation emerges into view. A Christianity that is easy to bear, that is the symbolic exaltation of what is going on anyway, and what determines the way of the world is anemic. Metz contends that to be close to Jesus is to be close to danger, for it requires a political theology of conversion and repentance and discipleship in solidarity with the poor. Thus, Metz's theology prompts reflection not only on the dangerous memory of Jesus, but the dangerous witness to life in Christ. Again, I've given you enough. Conversations, questions, pushback, whatever, observations. Yes.
I'm having a hard time with the use of the word dangerous.
Yeah.
Are we using, or in this concept, are we using dangerous to say Christ was dangerous to the Romans in upsetting that? Or are we using it to say in his life he faced danger? I mean, it's like one is the dangerous person that's coming in, the other is I'm going into danger. So I'm just having a hard time with
So
the word.
you could do with danger just what I did with the cross large and small. Cross letters of landscape. So danger can be large, it can be small. Persecution. It is well known that Jesus was criticized by, for example, who he ate with. He ate with outcasts and sinners. He was always upsetting the status quo. Sometimes we tend, overwhelmingly, we tend to minimize what the kinds of things that Jesus did that upset the status quo. But remember that it upset the status quo so much that it led to his crucifixion. So it was dangerous. Next week, I don't know if I'm going to do it, but I think I might do it, get into a new take on the book of Galatians, which talks about how Paul was upset with the Galatian Christians because they were blending into the empire rather than contrasting with the empire and offering an alternative, which would have been dangerous. It would have put them. It can also be a small thing. I'm trying to remember the guy's name who came to New York Avenue once. It was a fascinating experiment that he had. It was right after the 2016 election. And he had the suspicion that if all white allies would have conversations with friends and family that they knew disagreed with them on issues of race and this, that, and the other, that it would make a huge difference. And so he did training with us as to how to do that. And part of that training was how to live with the tension that will ensue or the backlash. And you can imagine, I mean, you've been to Thanksgiving dinners where you just don't talk about things, right? Or with your friends, where you just don't talk about things. That's dangerous. Okay, does that help?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, yes.
I had exactly the same question, and what spoke to me was up there, is can be dangerous to, it can be dangerous to be in solidarity with the poor.
Yeah.
That presents danger too, to the extent that the theology of the cross is about aligning yourself with the poor and the downtrodden. In society, in public society, that can be a dangerous position to take.
at the tail end of this essay, and I may get to it next week, and I may not get to it. So let me just summarize it to show where it's going. If I don't get to it, then I will talk about it. One of the most significant events I was involved in community organizing was the Living Wage campaign in Baltimore. Little known but true, if you've ever been to Baltimore, you know, if you've ever been to the Ravens Stadium or the Orioles Stadium, I was a crazy Orioles fan when I was 12 years in Baltimore, crazy Orioles fan. The Inner Harbor development down there, which developed what was a shipping area, was done on the promise, $2 billion worth of subsidies over 40 years was on the promise of good jobs for folk in the urban areas, particularly Black folk in Baltimore. That was the promise. It was voted on many referendums over the course of 40 years, voting on that promise, and they never came about. Minimum wage jobs throughout the entire industry, everywhere. And so we started what we called the Living Wage campaign. And the living wage back then, we were talking about the 90s. We were talking about moving that up to $9 an hour, which would be, what would that be in today's terms? Some of you are economists that are sensitive to this than I do, maybe at least 15, maybe more than that. And you know who I got the most pushback from? My own church. I had folk in my church who were part of that development of the Inner Harbor. Jim, have you ever heard the name Jim Rouse?
Yeah.
He was a member of my church. Okay, and people coming to me and saying, Roger, what are you doing? A job is better than no job. But what we were seeing in the urban areas was that $4.15 an hour, which was a minimum wage at that time, did not enable you to create a life. And but my folk was saying, yeah, but it's a ladder up. No, it's not. And we can prove it over and over and over again. And we tried to do that, but I got pushback. And it was one of the, and you know, we finally, by the way, the other thing I did at that church was we became a more like church, gay affirming church. That was one of the most difficult things I did. This was the second most difficult things I did. So yeah, it was just unbelievable pushback. And Francis will tell you, there were several times I just saw and say, oh, excuse me, I'm like, what the hell with this? I'm leaving that church. Yeah, almost did.
So humankind, you know, we come through the Civil War, Reconstruction, we didn't figure it out. World War I, League of Nations, we didn't figure it out. World War II, Holocaust, but still, incrementally, we're getting better and better at having after that resolution stuff that works for the next big thing. What is your optimistic approach to that?
My optimism is organizing people. So I'm going to push back a little bit. I think there has been some progress, but I am an Augustinian, Calvinistic, Niebuhrian, Reformed Christian, which means that sin is pervasive, it is deep, it is ingrained, and if you give people power, they're not going to give it up. And that's Reinhold Niebuhr. And so I am not optimistic. I'm not as optimistic about what's coming out of Scotland. The World of Nations is not going to address this stuff environmentally. It's not, what does it take? If that doesn't prove ingrained human perversity, then I don't know what does. And how many times do you have to get folk from poor nations that are going underwater, coming to these kind of conferences and saying, we're going underwater because of your pollution? How many times does that have to happen? So okay, yeah, incremental, the civil rights bill, it was the voting law, which was somewhat gutted by the Supreme Court. You get, backlash is happening everywhere. So every movement forward, there's a backlash. My hope is Let me give you a story. Do I have just enough time for this? I'm sorry. I get excited when I start talking about this stuff. So, it was not last September, no, excuse me. 2 Septembers ago, through a circuitous set of circumstances, I had been leading studies of Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist at Second Presbyterian and a few other places. And somebody got wind of it, said there's a church in Virginia Beach in the middle of territory that is not friendly to them. That is, I'm not trying to be, I'm trying to be political without being political here, saying names. And they want to do a study of Kendi's book, and by the way, they don't have any money. And so I came cheap, and they said, would you lead us in that study? So for 4 weeks, I had 12 people, and we walked through Kendi's. If you've ever not read that book, that's a fabulous book. And it's a hard book. It's not hard to read, it's hard to grasp. You have to go through it several times to grasp all that he's doing in that book. But we went 4 weeks in that book, and finally, at the end of the session, we just talked about it, and said, okay. Then finally said, so what are we going to do? And there was kind of despair at some point. And somebody finally said, there's only 12 of us. And I said, there are 12 of you. And there are 12 of you at another church in Virginia Beach. And there are 12 of you at another, and another, and another. And by the way, I don't know a session in the Presbyterian Church that if 12 people came forward and said, we've got to address this, that they won't take notice, right? That's what gives me hope. Sorry, I get excited about this stuff. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I think the world every day is politically dangerous. Tomorrow in Wisconsin, I'm not going to say what side I'm on, but Ben Crump spoke at my son's graduation at Virginia State University in December. Y'all should pull it up. It is most fabulous. But if this white young man, I don't know, it just, every day.
So part of my mission in retirement is doing stuff like this and talking to churches about how as a collective we can be something, and we can witness to our faith that in Christ we have the foundation for the new creation. That in Christ we have a foundation to actually change our world, and that's part of my goal and mission. And I hope maybe at the end of 2 weeks, maybe there's a seed that's placed in it. I guess
By the way, did you go to college? I was just wondering if you were passionate about your school sports, or about the issues we're talking about here too.
Well, I was a swimmer, so it was a minor sport back then, and so yes, I would like people to be passionate about minor sports.
All right, well, if you're here today, you're going to stay for church, please stay for Wilson's reception following. This is his last Sunday. Stay there. For those of you on Zoom, we'll see you next Sunday. Look forward